Author Shereen El Feki sees an Arab world embracing change both politically and sexually. She's the author of Sex and the Citadel, Intimate Life in a Changing Arab World, and she joins us now. Great to meet you.
Same here, Steve.
And the folks are in Waterloo, so
they are
not far away.
I'm sure they are watching.
And you were raised there?
I was.
Even though you live all over the world now?
Exactly.
I love the title.
Thank you.
Now, has Sarah Jessica Parker been in touch about copyright infringement or anything like that?
Not as yet.
Not as yet. But you clearly want to play off Sex and the City with Sex and the Citadel.
In part, but the Citadel in my title has a very specific meaning.
That's the place in Egypt.
It is. It's a physical structure. It's the great fortress that overlooks Cairo. But I use it as a metaphor to talk about the only socially accepted context for sexual life, which is marriage. And this marriage has to be religiously approved. It has to be approved by the family. It has to be registered by the state. Now, the problem is that increasingly in the Arab world, not everyone fits inside the Citadel. And the question is, what do we do for the people who are outside the Citadel?
I can't imagine there are many more taboo topics that you could write about than, and you do write graphically about sex in the Arab world. And I want to know how come this was an important topic for you to put into a book.
Well, there are two parts to this question. Why sex and why sex in the Arab world? So the two parts relate to two parts of my life. And the first is personal. I am half Egyptian, and most of my family live in Egypt. I am Muslim, but as you say, I grew up in Waterloo. And when I was growing up, I really never thought very much about my Arab heritage. September 11th changed all that for me. And the events of that day and the aftermath really stimulated me to want to know more about where I came from and the Arabs and Muslims, what makes them tick. So that's the personal side and why I decided to focus on the Arab world. That I chose sex for my lens, I appreciate, is unusual. But the reason for that stems from my professional background and my work on HIV/AIDS. I trained as an immunologist. I was the healthcare correspondent for The Economist for many years. And more recently, I was vice chair of the UN's Global Commission on HIV and the Law. If you want to understand HIV in the Arab world, you have to look at sex, because it is the major route of transmission for most known cases.
But I've never read a book like this before. And you say you've got to look at it, but lots of people have managed not to look at it for a very long time.
That's true, but the reason I looked at sexuality, so sex in the context of HIV is a useful but narrow lens. Sexuality, which is also beliefs and values, is this amazing instrument with which to probe a society because it brings in politics and economics and religion and gender and generations. At the end of the day, if you want to know a people, start by looking inside their bedrooms.
Yes, although Pierre Trudeau once said the state has no business in the bedrooms of the country, but you've disregarded his advice and you're right in there.
I was not there in an official governmental capacity.
That is a very good point. Okay. How difficult was it? Because I know there is a lot of talk in here that's very direct by people with whom I would assume it would have been hard to have a direct conversation about these kinds of things. Was it?
It was surprisingly easy.
That's what it looks like, yeah.
And I think it was because of my insider-outsider status. So because I am Egyptian and because I am Muslim, people, and in particular women, felt quite comfortable speaking to me because they thought I knew where they came from. I had a connection culturally. On the other hand, you're looking at me and I have all the fair features of my Welsh mother, and quite frankly, my figure is more Arrow than arabesque. And that was a benefit for me because many people in the Arab world have ideas about sexual life in the West, and one of the ideas is that it's a free-for-all and people can talk about anything and there is no judgment. And so women in particular, who often bear the burden of societal standards and stigma and taboo around sex, felt comfortable talking to me because they thought that I wouldn't judge them, and that was exactly the case. So inside outside could have been the worst of both worlds, but it actually turned out to be the best.
When we were all watching those pictures on CNN of Tahrir Square and the hundreds of thousands of people who were gathering, my hunch is 99% of us thought political revolution. At that moment, were you thinking, I wonder if this is going to unveil a sexual revolution as well?
Well, it's interesting you use the term political revolution, because in my book I never talk about revolution. It's unrest, it's uprising. If by revolution you mean a dramatic break with the past,
I think you say it's actually not revolution, it's reevaluation.
that's a separate issue, but it's a good point. It's not a dramatic break with the past. What we've seen are new faces essentially trying to govern business as usual, but less effectively than the old regime. So if we're not seeing revolution in political life, to my mind, we're not going to see revolution in sexual life, because sexuality is so much more complex than politics. It brings in the politics and everything else. And so, no, I wasn't looking and thinking, there's going to suddenly be a complete change in attitudes and behaviors. We are seeing some change in some areas, but it will take decades for change to unfold in aspects of sexual life. And it's not necessarily going to play out as change has been seen elsewhere in the world.
Sure, but what was the one thing that you saw that you thought, that could be a spark? We never know. Talk to me in 50 years, but that could be the spark. Okay,
I'll give you a more recent example. If one looks at the events that surrounded the second anniversary of the Egyptian uprising and all the talk of the sexual attacks, the rapes of women around Tahrir Square. 10, 15 years ago, a woman would never dare to go on television and say, I had been raped. And now you find that happening. Not all women, some women. They are talking about something which is deeply shameful. And you must remember, this is not just a question of individual shame or individual reputation, it's the family's reputation. And particularly, it's the men folks' reputation. They are speaking out. They have men sitting beside them saying, this is not right. Women have the right to protest. And they are out on the streets staking their claim. Now, it's a small aspect of sexuality. It's freedom from violence. However, it is a beginning, and it gives me hope.
It gives you hope, but one has to ask the question, what makes you think that this kind of sexual, call it what you want, revolution, reevaluation, can happen in a region of the world that is so heavily influenced by not just Islam, but by Islamists?
If we're looking specifically at Egypt, the trends towards narrow, conservative interpretations of Islam across the board in all areas of life, but in particular in the role of women and around sexuality, have been gaining ground for decades. It's been under the table. Now, after the overthrow of the Mubarak regime, it's now on the table. And what is fascinating is that you see people challenging it at every level. If we look back over the past few months since the election of President Morsi, we have seen nonstop protests, civil disobedience, strikes, lawsuits, you name it, people are finding their voice. And as I said, it was very hard to challenge these austere interpretations of Islam for as long as they were happening underground, if you like, in resistance to a dictatorship. Now that they're out in the open, people are asking very hard questions of politics that they never dared to do before. And remember, politics is one of the 3 red lines we have in the Arab world. It's politics, it's religion, and guess what's the 3rd red line?
I think we're writing about it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So asking hard questions of politics, now because the politics are connected to religion, people are starting to ask questions about the role of Islam in public life. And what I'm hoping to do with this book is to encourage people to ask those questions of sexual life.
Well, I must confess, I've probably covered hundreds of demonstrations in my time as a reporter and then host of this program. And I've never seen a sign the likes of which you described in this book, which was a guy at a demonstration in Tahrir Square saying, Mubarak must go, I want to get married. Can you explain that in the context of the Middle East?
So remember the Citadel I talked about, which is sex within marriage, and then the people outside the Citadel. So a very large number of people are young people who can't afford to get married. The age of marriage has risen quite significantly in much of the Arab world, and the exemplar of this is Tunisia, where the age of marriage for men is now around early 30s and for women late 20s. Remember, if you can't get married, you really can't move out of your parents' place. You're probably financially dependent on your parents as well. You can't get a job, which is one of the major drivers of the Arab Spring. And therefore, if you're not having an independent life, you're not really having much of a personal life, it's very hard when the individual is not really defined so much as within the context of the collective, the family, or the tribe. And if you're not having a personal life, you're not supposed to be having a sexual life, particularly if you're a young woman. So this man, who was his pro-marriage placard, was essentially blaming the government for not being able to provide a job for him, which meant that he could marry and essentially move out of the waiting room of adulthood into a fully fledged independent existence.
Can we talk about sex before marriage? It's not forbidden in the Quran, right?
It is haram. It is forbidden.
It is haram,
Sex
forbidden.
outside of marriage is zina, which is adultery. So that's either not having sex with your spouse.
But there's lots of it happening. I mean, I read your book. There's lots of it happening.
It is.
So,
can I just point out, it's very
yeah.
hard to get an empirical handle on this. So if I can give you one example.
Sure.
I was part of a youth survey in Egypt, 2008, 2009. We asked all sorts of questions in this national assessment of attitudes of young people under age 29. Talked about politics, talked about economics, talked about leisure activities. We wanted to ask about sex. Government wouldn't let us. And that was the Mubarak regime, a more secular regime than today's government. If we look in other countries in the Arab world, some of them have been able to ask these questions. And when you do, you find this very interesting finding, which I call really the sort of 50-20 gap. So when you ask young men under the age of 29, most of whom in much of the Arab world are unmarried, have you had relations before marriage? They will say yes, and they will go on to describe the various forms. And it's often much higher than 50%, 60%, 70%, 80%. It depends on where you're asking and whom you're asking. If you ask young women the same question, almost across the board, you find that less than 20% of young women are admitting to sex before marriage. Now, this raises the obvious question, whom are all these young men having relations with? Yeah. The reality is that the burden of virginity falls very heavy on women. Now, in the Quran, we are exhorted as Muslims, both men and women, to remain chaste before marriage. But the reality is that in a patriarchy, boys will be boys, and women are held to higher standards.
So it's haram, but not really for men.
It is haram, but people do it anyway, and socially you turn a blind eye.
And you can be a devout Muslim and still have sex before marriage and consider yourself a devout Muslim?
Some people do, but again, it's the question of how do they define Islam to themselves. If you want to follow the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah, the example of the Prophet, then no, sex outside of marriage is haram. Now, I need to point out that many young people, because they are having to wait to get married, because they can't afford to get married, it's very expensive, are turning to other forms of marriage, informal marriage, which may or may not be Islamically permissible. It depends on which scholar you speak to. But young people turn to these forms of marriage because they are desperate to fit inside the Citadel. They don't want to pull down the Citadel. But until they can get in there, they are trying to find an Islamic cover for their relations.
If you go to a bookstore or a magazine shop in this city, you will find any number of different titles offering you all sorts of advice to men and women on sex and sexuality. What's the situation in Cairo?
It's limited. I can give you, if I can tell you a story. So I was interested in what women had to say about male performance. And in particular, wives were complaining to me that their husbands were not particularly good in bed, and that they were terribly selfish, and they only take 5 minutes, and there's no foreplay, and he falls asleep, then he puts on the television. So I gave them some books, the desert romances, because this is at such odds with the reputation of the Arab lover of E.M. Hull's The Sheikh, for example, from the early 1900s. And I gave these books to my friends, and they were absolutely flabbergasted. How on earth do Western women think that men are like this? But what's interesting is I tried to find some of these books with my female friends in downtown Cairo, and it was very difficult. There were some books that were giving advice in an Islamic context, do's and don'ts of sexual practice within the context of Islam. But for many women, there's simply not this, the frank and free and open joy of sex sort of book in Arabic. I can tell you that we went to look for some of these, the Arabic equivalents of these romances, and one of my friends who is muhajjaba, she covers her hair, she's a very devout Muslim, the shop assistant took her aside and said, "Really, madam, you shouldn't be asking for these sort of books." And certainly there are young women in particular who are plugged into the internet, who speak English, who have access to the wider world of sexual information, some of which can be quite baffling. But for many Egyptian women I've met who don't have that access, it's quite hard to find advice on sexual matters. And they're desperate for information because sexuality education is so poor in Egypt and across most of the Arab world that they're really at a loss for information. And like anyone else in the world, they have lots of questions.
If one were to walk down the main streets of Cairo, would you ever see a Victoria's Secret shop or something like that?
Oh, absolutely.
You would?
Absolutely. If you go into the streets of downtown Cairo off Tahrir Square, you will see some of the most lurid displays of lingerie one could imagine, really flights of fantasy. And when I asked many of my very devout friends, do you not see this lingerie as a form of male oppression? They said, no, quite the contrary. For us to initiate sexual activity with our husbands, for us to say that we want to have relations, that would be shameful. But we can signal it in other ways, and lingerie is very important to us because we can send out the message without actually having to articulate it.
So are you seeing the seeds of sexual liberation insofar as we're not just talking generically, but for women? That women are starting to realize actually our interests and our priorities as they relate to sex, they're actually moving higher up society's agenda. Are you seeing that?
Well, I think we need to define our terms very carefully because many people whom I interviewed in the Arab region are not talking about sexual liberation as we speak of it in the West, for example. I think what we're talking about really at the end of the day is the achievement of sexual rights. And by that, I mean the ability to have a happy, satisfying, and pleasurable sexual life free of violence, discrimination, and coercion. And that is something to which millions of people are aspiring within the framework of their faith. At the moment, people are not making the connection between what's happening in their bedroom and what's happening on the political scene. So to give you one example, I was down in Tahrir Square during some of these protests, and when there were young people fighting and quite literally dying in the side streets against security forces. And I asked one particular young protester, do you think that the political freedom that you are fighting for would one day lead to sexual freedom? And he was absolutely aghast. No, no, no.
Aghast that you would even ask the question?
No, aghast that there would be a connection between the two. No, he said. We are Muslim, we are Arab, we believe in the marriage institution, he told me. We are looking for political freedom, we are looking for social freedom, but not this sexual freedom. That being said, I met other protesters, particularly young women, who were making the connection. But at the moment, it still seems to be very far apart in most people's minds.
Let me raise the very unpleasant topic of female circumcision. How common a practice is this throughout the Arab world still?
It only occurs in certain countries in the Arab region, and let me speak specifically of Egypt, where 90% of women under age 50 who have ever been married are circumcised. And if you look at a younger cohort, around 15 to 17 years of age, about 80% of girls have undergone female genital mutilation.
You want to just tell us what it is?
It takes various forms in different countries, but the form that's done in Egypt involves the cutting or excision of the clitoris, and it will often take the neighboring flaps of flesh with it.
And mothers do this to their daughters, or they allow it, they take their daughters to have this done.
Yes, it's mainly a mother's or a grandmother's decision. Men are not really involved in the equation, and it's done mainly by doctors now in Egypt, not by the traditional midwife as in the past.
So it's a lot less, I mean, it sounds like a pretty gruesome practice, even under medical supervision. Am I right to say that, or am I being sort of too Western in saying that it seems like a pretty barbaric thing to do?
It is a very intrusive procedure. I want to point out, however, that these women are not doing it because they want to be cruel. to their girls. They're doing it because they love their daughters, and they feel that this will give their daughters a better chance in life.
A better chance of what?
Okay. So there are a couple of reasons why women will do this. They argue tradition, it has always been done. They will argue religion, that there is a saying of the prophet which endorses this practice. The reality is that hadith is of dubious authenticity, and the major Islamic and Christian leaders in Egypt have come out against the practice, as saying that it has no basis in religion. The other reason, and really the main driver, is the conception of female sexuality.
It takes away their sex drive, doesn't it?
Well, we'll come to that.
Okay.
So
sorry, I'm getting ahead of the game here.
They believe that if you tame the clitoris, that girls will be less likely to want to have sex before marriage, and they will be less demanding of their husbands during marriage, both of which could be marriage killers. Remember, the Citadel is very important. Getting married is very important, and staying married is very important. Divorce is still highly stigmatizing for women in most communities in the Arab world. So this is the justification that women give for doing FGM. Now, it's based on faulty information.
Female genital mutilation, I guess, is what you've... FGM.
Yes, FGM, female genital mutilation. Now, it's based on faulty information of what the clitoris can and cannot do, but the important thing to keep in mind is that these women have power. They have agency. They are making decisions. Now, the key to eradicating the practice is to harness that power and to have them make a decision which is different and in the greater interests of their child's rights. The problem is, how do you get them to make that decision? Because during the Mubarak regime, for example, there was a law passed in 2008 which criminalized FGM. And yet, most people completely ignored it because they saw it as a law coming from a dictatorial, undemocratic government that was effectively in hock to the West and was trying to push a Western sexual rights agenda. It doesn't work if the seed drops from 37,000 feet. It has to waft in from the grassroots for it to take root. There have been great projects in Egypt and across the Arab world trying to change attitudes towards FGM, and they have been quite successful. So according to predictions, if these campaigns were to continue at the same speed, that by 2025, only about 50% of young women would be circumcised, and that's a dramatic drop. The problem is that we now have Islamists with political clout, and they are at best ambivalent about the practice, and some actively endorse it. So it's not certain whether the fight against FGM will continue, but certainly if you phrase it right and you recognize the intelligence and the decision-making power of women, you can affect change.
At what age are girls usually forced to undergo this?
It's around 9 to 12 years of age.
And I mean, at no point do the mothers ever say to the... It's the mothers that want this done to their daughters, right? Not necessarily the fathers?
Exactly. Most men are ambivalent about it. And when you explain it to them and the impact of clipping the clitoris, they'll often say, yes, that might explain why my wife is so cold in bed. But I have to tell you that there was a great study done in Egypt with which I was associated, which looked at male attitudes towards FGM and the whole question of sexuality as it relates to female genital mutilation. And one of the really fascinating findings of the study is the effect of pornography. So there's a lot of porn going down in Egypt and across the Arab world, despite the efforts of governments to clamp down on it. And one of the things that was happening is that men know that women in the West are not circumcised. And so they would see these videos with one woman having sex with 3 men, and they would say, you see, we told you so. If you don't circumcise women, this is what happens.
This is what you're going to get.
So they're very unintended consequences of the process of globalization. It's a complex situation on the ground, but there has been progress, and the key now is keeping up the momentum and just hanging on to the gains that have been made.
Well, let's finish up our first part on that then, with about a minute and a half to go here. How inevitable, the process of change that you're describing in here, how inevitable do you think it is?
What, political change, sexual change,
sexual
social
change? Yeah.
It's not inevitable at all. It's a very, very long process. And as we mentioned earlier, I'm not talking about a sexual revolution here. I'm talking about a sexual reevaluation in which people will start asking questions of why are things the way they are today, and starting to find answers, I hope, that make sense for them along the grain of their religion and their culture.
But I infer from here that you think the arrow is pointed unmistakably in a direction you'd like to see, But it's not inevitable that that arrow is going to hit its target. Fair to say?
The target needs to be defined by people on the ground. I think, again, if we have this definition of the ability of people to seek information about sex, to create information about sex, to make decisions about their own sexual life, a lot of things are going to happen on the macro scale, political, economic, social, for that to happen. But if those things do happen, they need to be reflected in the bedroom as well, for them to really take hold on both sides, inside the bedroom and out.
Well, that was a fascinating first half hour. And because of that, you're going to have to come back tomorrow, and we're going to have to do another half hour. So thank you, Shereen. That's Sex in the Citadel, Intimate Life in a Changing Arab World. And Shereen will be with us again tomorrow night for part 2. And we're going to talk about same-sex relationships tomorrow, which, again, speaking of taboo subjects, you're right up there with this one.
Looking forward to it.
So we'll do it again tomorrow.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.